Good morning, dear teachers, students, and guests. Welcome to the Faculty of Science Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Hoi Kwang Lo, Research Division Director of Physics Astronomy at the University of Hong Kong. Today, we have the honor to have Professor Priyamvada Natarajan to speak to us about the universe. The title of her talk is Unveiling the Dark Universe. What I will do is I will briefly introduce our panel members. Our moderator would be Dr. Jane Guy, who would actually introduce the speaker later. And our panel members include external people. They are from CUHK, Professor Ming-Chung Chi, Professor Johnny Lee, HKUST, Professor Yi Yan, and also we have our Hong Kong U colleagues here, Professor Quinton Tucker, Dr. Jeremy Lim, and Dr. Stephen Ng. Without much ado, I would just pass the floor to our moderator, Dr. Jane Guy, to introduce the speaker. Thank you much for coming. So Jane, okay.
Okay, thank you, Heiko. Hello, everyone. Dear teachers, students, and guests, welcome to the Faculty Science Distinguished Lecture. I am Jane Dai, an astrophysicist and assistant professor in the Department of Physics at Hong Kong U Science. Our cosmic inventory reveals that we inhabit a peculiar universe, which is dominated by invisible dark entities, dark matter, dark energy, and black holes. The bulk of the matter content of our universe is dominated by dark matter, comprising an inert, elusive, and as yet undetected particle that likely formed in the early universe. The measured accelerating expansion of the universe, we believe, is driven by dark energy, whose nature remains largely unknown as well. Black holes, while scarcely contributing in terms of the overall mass budget, however, appear to be littered throughout the universe and fundamentally structure the visible universe. So in this talk, Professor Natarajan will discuss what we know and how we know the significance of these dark entities. She will also review our current state of understanding, focusing on many intriguing open questions and future observations that will help unveil even more of the dark universe. Today, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Professor Priyamvada Natarajan. Professor Natarajan is not only professor in the Department of Astronomy and Physics at Yale University, she is also the director of the Frank Program in Science and Humanities. She also currently serves on the National Astronomy and Astrophysics Advisory Committee that advises NASA, NSF, and DOE of the US. She is also an active member of the NASA LISA science team. Professor Natarajan's research is focused on exotica in the universe, dark matter, dark energy, and black holes. Her research has focused on confronting and testing theoretical ideas with observational data in astrophysics. She is noted for seminal contributions to two of the most challenging problems in cosmology, mapping the distribution of dark matter and tracing the growth history of black holes. Professor Natarajan is also keen on communicating science to the general public. She wrote the well-acclaimed book, Mapping the Universe, the Radical Scientific Ideas That Reveal the Cosmos, which many people, including myself, thoroughly enjoyed reading and learning from. So in recognition of her research excellence and contributions to science, Professor Natarajan receives many honors and awards, including the Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships. She also holds the Sophie and Tycho Brahe Professorship at the Dark Center, Niels Bohr Institute. She was also the first woman in astrophysics to be elected a fellow at Trinity College, Cambridge. Okay, without further ado, I will now pass the floor to Professor Natarajan.
So first, I just wanted to say thank you very much to Professor Dai and all the faculty of sciences at Hong Kong University for giving me this opportunity to share some exciting new results and directions, open questions that I'm sure a lot of the students will be excited to hear. My goal in this talk is to try to show those of you younger researchers who are excited and interested in astrophysics that there are many, many problems yet to be solved. So it's an amazing field to work in where there's going to be a huge deluge of data very soon. So I hope to convey to you tonight, well, today morning, sorry, I'm on the East Coast in the United States and it's evening, to share with you some of the challenges. So I have, of course, taken on the very ambitious task of addressing both these enigmatic quantities in the universe, dark matter and dark energy. So the way I have structured my talk is that I'm going to first address dark matter. So give you a little bit of a context and address what we know about dark matter, how we know it, what the open questions are, and what the prospects are in terms of new observational data. And then I will move on to talking about what we know about black holes. And there I will focus on one question, which I think is particularly exciting, and that has to do with the origin of the first black holes. So that's what I'm going to sort of, to give you a lay of the land of this talk. So I have visited Hong Kong before. I love it. I so wish I could have been there in person. But, you know, this is next best. And I'm really delighted to speak to you all. And I'm also grateful for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Jane, for that. Okay, so the portion of my talk about dark matter is going to really focus on what is now established as the standard paradigm in terms of what we know about the universe and structure formation in the universe that is driven by dark matter. And what I want to show you, I'll show you a little bit of the development of the standard paradigm, what the key pieces of the paradigm are. And then, of course, as the data has gotten much, much better over the last 2 decades, and computational models, cosmological simulations, where we simulate a piece of the universe, have gotten more and more sophisticated, it allows us to now stress test the standard paradigm in ways you couldn't do before. So that's sort of where I'm going with what I'm going to share today about dark matter. So I just want to give a shout out to many of my collaborators who over the years, so much of the work that I'm going to talk about is work that was really enabled, modeling and theoretical work and insights that were enabled by Hubble Space Telescope data. So I am giving a shout out to many theorists and observers that I have worked with over the last couple of decades. So as was mentioned in the introduction, one of the peculiar things about our universe is that now we've had multiple independent ways to probe the constituents of our universe. And it turns out that Einstein's theory of general relativity that provides a very good description of our universe is basically a geometric theory where the contents, the fate, and the geometry of our universe are intricately linked. So if you know any two things, if you know the inventory and you know the geometry, then you determine the fate. And what I mean by fate is past, present, and future of the universe. So the analysis in this sort of grand context of Einstein's theory of general relativity as the backbone that describes our universe, where if we do an inventory of the contents, we find a very peculiar universe. So that's what you see in this pie chart in the bottom of the slide, where it appears that the primary constituents of our universe, the two major components, are actually highly mysterious. One is dark energy, that's about 73% of the overall cosmic inventory. I will not be talking about that today. It's an open question, and very much like dark matter, it was very recently discovered, though unlike dark matter, only in 1998 we discovered dark energy. We know what it does in the universe, and I'll talk about that briefly, but we don't know what it is yet. Okay, much like dark matter. So the major component of matter in our universe appears to be dark matter. And it's called dark matter for a good reason. It doesn't couple, it doesn't interact electromagnetically. So it doesn't interact with light on any wavelength. And it has gravity, however. So the only effects by which we infer its presence and understand its nature is through its gravitational effects. As we'll see, there are some interesting gravitational effects that allow us, in fact, to actually exquisitely map the spatial distribution of dark matter. And I shouldn't forget that the ordinary atoms that we are made of are barely 5% of the total inventory. So it's a weird universe where in terms of the past, present, and future, we started from a dense, hot Big Bang, an expanding universe, and that is now currently undergoing accelerated expansion. So that's what's going on with the fate of the universe. In terms of the geometry of the universe, we believe that globally our universe is flat. However, locally it's not, as we'll see in a minute. So the evidence, we have evidence now for a little bit more of an insight into the nature of dark matter. And the insights point to a very weird component. It is a collisionless component. What that means is there seem to be almost no self-interaction, so that the equation of state that we believe for dark matter is P equals 0. So it's a pressureless fluid. And that's pretty bizarre, right? I mean, if you remember all the gases that we study in chemistry that follow Boyle's law, PV equals nRT, so pressure is proportional to the temperature, inversely proportional to the volume. So this dark matter just does not collide. Two dark matter particles actually graze past each other and just interact. They just exert a slight tug of gravity when they get close. So the ways in which we have discovered dark matter have been two primary ways, as I mentioned, from its gravitational influence. First is the gravitational influence and the impact on the motions of stars. So from the motions of stars in galaxies, they appear to be moving. So this you see is a rotation curve, and the speeds of stars measured from the center outside suggest that they're moving much faster than you would expect if all the matter was just visible matter, if all the gravity was provided only by the visible matter. And so this was postulated in the 1970s by Vera Rubin and her collaborators, who detected this made this measurement in some spiral galaxies. And so they discovered that, a typical spiral galaxy has almost 10 times as much matter, gravitating matter, that is dark, and that's collisionless, compared to the visible matter in the stars and the gas and the dust. So the other way, so that's very Newtonian, right? So you're just measuring the force of gravity, the impact of the force of gravity, measuring the accelerations of the stars, the velocities of the stars, and you are confirming that the gravitational potential is deeper than it would be with just the visible matter. Now, the other way is using Einstein's theory of general relativity, where the prediction is that any aggregation of matter in the universe, whether it's dark matter or normal matter, an aggregation of matter would bend light. So you have distant light rays from distant sources, distant galaxies. If you have a foreground lump of matter, in this case, it's going to turn out that it's dark matter, it will cause deflections in the paths of the lights, as we'll see. And that is called gravitational lensing. So much of the work that I'm going to show you today, neat results that I'm going to show you today, have been derived from gravitational lensing studies. So I talked about the standard paradigm. So the standard paradigm is one in which the universe, as we saw in the pie chart, is dominated by cold dark matter, this collisionless dark matter. And we believe it aggregates only due to gravity. It does not exert any other force. It doesn't feel any other source. And if at all it interacts very, very weakly. So gravity is the dominant interaction for cold dark matter. And it turns out that cold dark matter drives all the structure formation in the universe. And the galaxies that we see, all the ordinary atoms, the gas that collapse to form stars and galaxies, does so in the scaffolding of dark matter, in the background of this dark matter. And it's dark matter that really structures the universe. However, we know that on a macro scale. However, we still don't know what the individual dark matter particle is. So there are lots of theories, and you see that in that rainbow colored chart that I have there. Those are all the possibilities. But as astrophysicists, we have been stuck on two possibilities. We'll have two favorites. One has been WIMPs, these weakly interacting massive particles. And the other recent fad, the recent one, because we've not found WIMPs after looking for them for more than 2 decades, we've now started exploring slightly lighter particles, lighter dark matter particles called axions. That's the orangish stuff that you see here, orangish purplish stuff, and the blue in the diagram that I've shown you. So this cold dark matter model, in which matter aggregates only via gravity, has a clear-cut sequence for how galaxies form. So galaxies form because you have these halos of dark matter that condenses with gravity, forms these halos, gravitational potential wells, in which the ordinary atoms, baryons, fall, cool, get denser, form stars, and that's how they form the visible component. So one of the predictions of this theory is the actual ways in which these lumps of dark matter gravitationally settle. They have a density profile that is very well defined. And so that's what is shown here in the colored, in the black profiles. So this profile is typically, this is the kind of distribution of dark matter density, for example, in the halo within which the Milky Way now sits, the dark matter halo, in which we believe that, as I mentioned earlier, every galaxy, every visible structure has a dark scaffolding in which it is sitting. It's just the tip of the iceberg is the visible matter. So this is the dark matter profile that is defined. And in this theory, it turns out, so the idea is, this is the theoretical idea. Now you have to confront it with observations, right? So that's the actual test of the theory. And as the data, as I mentioned earlier, as the data has gotten better and computations have gotten better, we can do these comparisons very, very well. So when these comparisons were done about 15 years ago, there was one problem that showed up in the standard theory, which is, remember the density profile that we just saw, the predictions of the theory and the predictions derived from data did not match. So it appeared that data appeared to flatten, to have profiles, density profiles that are not as peaky in the center. Matter is not as lumped in the center, but that it actually tapers off. And this was a problem for this standard model. But it was resolved. And the way it was resolved was because we understood better how the baryons and the dark matter interact gravitationally. Remember, they don't interact any other way, but they do interact gravitationally. So when we understood that better, this was no longer a problem. Then another problem showed up. So in the standard model, and that is a number counting problem. So you have a galaxy like the Milky Way. It's part of something called the local group. There are lots of satellites. And the question is, how many satellites are predicted by the theory and how many do we see? So it turns out that we saw far fewer satellites than the theory predicted, right? So the real universe appeared to have fewer satellites. And that was a source of tension because, as I said, this cold dark matter theory, one of the powerful things about this theory, it makes very concrete predictions. So this, again, mismatch was resolved because it turns out that we just didn't have telescopes that were able to find the very faint satellite galaxies. And now that we found them, there's a better match. Okay, so now let's go on to gravitational lensing, which is this technique of bending of light. And we're going to look at these objects, these huge aggregates of dark matter that exist in the universe, rare objects, but they're very massive. They're called clusters. They're about 10 to the 15 times the mass of the sun. And they deflect light. They're very good light deflectors because they're extremely massive. And they form late in the universe. So they're all sitting in the front as lenses to background sources, galaxies from which light is bent. And so these, as I said, these are objects we believe to be the largest repositories of dark matter in the universe. And here's a little schematic to give you a feel for how lensing works. So what is shown as a star is a distant galaxy. And the light from that galaxy So this galaxy's, the real position is this gray shaded star. It appears to be in this orange place because the light is actually deflected due to the presence of this matter. Now, the strength of this deflection is proportional to the mass of the deflector. It's called the lens. In our case, it's going to be the cluster, which has a lot of dark matter, and the overall sort of geometrical factors that depend on the underlying cosmology for cold dark matter and so on. So what we can do, and so this is another schematic that shows you how it works. So what we can do is we can go out, and if we have extremely good piercing eyes like the Hubble Space Telescope, you can actually see this light bending. The way this light bending manifests itself is that you see distorted shapes of distant galaxies. You no longer see their original shape, you see them very distorted. Luckily for us, these clusters are rare objects, so most of the universe you see undistorted, and there are small patches where you see these distortions. So you know what the standard shapes of galaxies undistorted should look like. So you have a background sense for that. And so because you know that, you can actually undo the distortions and figure out how much matter is there that is causing the distortions that we see. So it's like an inverse problem for those of you who are starting to study mathematical mapping. This is like you do an inverse problem, and you can map out the mass distribution that is causing the distortion that you're seeing. And so the Hubble Space Telescope really helped us understand them. And so this theory of geometric optics is very well understood in the context of Einstein's theory of general relativity. And what you can see is, how the undistorted and distorted shapes are related to each other as a function of the lens mass. So this is just a quick mapping that shows you. So if you have a source that lines up, it's a red circle. If the original shape is a red circle, if you plop a huge elliptical mass distribution in front of it, a lens, then it will get distorted and it will get split into those blue bits of arcs that you see, elongated arcs that you see. So all these geometries are actually mapped, they can be constructed, and in the universe, they're seen. So we can actually map it back. So we can go back and map the shape of this potential from the distortions that are seen. And so there are these effects that distortions can be extreme. They're called strong lensing, and there are a slight distortions, this minor change in shape, that's called weak lensing. So we have techniques that combine both of these observed distortions. And to just show you, the beautiful Hubble Space Telescope data where you see all these elongated arcs, slightly distorted arcs, extremely distorted arcs, and so on. So what we can do is, if we have a conceptual model, so this is a model that I developed during my PhD thesis, now decades ago now, where, and it has stood the test of time. This is sort of the standard view where you can model the gravitational potential of the cluster as a sum of components and perturbers. So, and the way we model it, we think of a smooth dark matter distribution and then lots of little clumps. And these clumps you associate with the locations of galaxies in the cluster. Why is this interesting? It turns out that cold dark matter makes a very clear prediction for the clump distribution, for the number of clumps you should find inside an object of a given mass. And it has a scaling with mass. So if you can go out and measure the clumpiness of a cluster, if you can map out the clumpiness from lensing, then you can actually compare with a simulation and test cold dark matter. So here is some fantastic Hubble Space Telescope data of lenses where you see this extreme distortion. You can reconstruct the maps, and then you can compare with the clumps, the clump distribution, with what you find in simulations, numerical simulations of the cold dark matter model. So when you do that, so this is from some recent work a couple of years ago now, what you see in the gray is the clump distribution for a simulated cluster in the cold dark matter universe, and the red histogram and curve that you see is for real data from a lensing cluster, which is not bad. I mean, the y-axis is left free, right? So that looked pretty good. So cold dark matter seems to be doing very well. Then we realized that the data has gotten much better. We are able to pick all these very tiny distortions in the last 6-7 years that we couldn't do even before because of the depth of the Hubble Space Telescope data. So then we thought about a new way, a new metric to test the model further, right? So let's look at the clumps, look at the properties of the clumps in a little more detail, not just the number of clumps, which we matched very well, but let's look at where the clumps are, what are the individual masses of the clumps, how concentrated are the clumps. And so we derived a new metric which allows you to not just count the number of clumps, but the properties of the clumps. And we derived this quantity called galaxy-galaxy strong lensing cross-section, which really has to do with the internal structure of the clumps, how tightly matter is packed in the inner parts of the clumps. And we found something really interesting, that the theory and the data, like the real universe and the simulated universe, are in disagreement by a factor of 10, which is huge. And we could not come up, so this is a paper that came out last year in Science in September 2020. And so this is an open, unresolved problem. And we tried everything. We tried all these solutions. And the answer is no, no, no. Is it an artifact? No. And so these are just detail. I won't spend too much time on this, but I urge you to go. I think I gave the Science paper as a suggested reading. And so there are only two possibilities left, and they are both extremely interesting possibilities. One is that maybe there's something about how dark matter and ordinary matter interact. It's only gravitational, we know that, but maybe it's still we are missing some element. We are missing something. Maybe our simulations are missing an ingredient. And this is very important because these simulations, remember in cosmology, we cannot do controlled experiments in a lab, right? I can't go and take a test tube and repeat the experiment 15 times and see if I get the right outcome. Why? Because we have one universe in which we are making measurements and we are sitting inside it, right? So simulations are our best. They are the cosmologist's experimental lab, right? So that's our apparatus. So if something fundamental is off in our simulations, gosh, that has really important implications. Of course, the other possibility, tantalizing, but possibility is that maybe there's something not quite right about what we've assumed about cold dark matter. Maybe it's not cold, maybe it's not all that collisionless after all. We don't know. I mean, so I think this is what is so exciting, that at this point the data is good enough that we can actually question the basic model itself. And this is a very successful model. So to have found a gap is a big deal, is very interesting. And I'm someone who's interested also very much in the history of ideas, and these gaps remind me of a very interesting anecdote from history. So in the solar system, when the orbit of Mercury, this was in the mid 1800s, the orbit of Uranus did not seem to follow Newton's laws. There was a slight wobble, it didn't work. So there was a French mathematician, Urbain Le Verrier, who realized that, aha, this is happening because there's another planet outside, beyond Uranus, and that's Neptune, that perturbs the system, and you need to take that into account. And so he actually predicted where you should find Neptune. So they went and they found Neptune, and he was right. Similarly, Mercury, there was a bit of a precession in the orbit of Mercury that was also not explained by Newton's theory of gravitation, Kepler's laws and all of that, right? So it was not explained. And the same mathematician, Urbain Le Verrier, said, he is economy of solution. He said, oh, same issue. So now he said, there's a planet between the sun and Mercury that we haven't seen yet. He called it Vulcan. And he said, that's what is causing a perturbation. So, people went and looked. There is no Vulcan, right? And so the way that was resolved, that discrepancy, that gap you had to wait for Einstein's theory of general relativity to resolve the Mercury orbit problem. So when you find a gap, you don't know if you just need to modify your current theory, like the first possibility I suggested, or if it is pointing the way to a brand new theory. And we know, for example, that theories of gravity are incomplete at the moment, right? So the data from upcoming space missions and simulations will really help us go back and check out this discrepancy and look more deeply into this. And so that's the sort of very exciting work that me and my collaborators are currently involved in. So now that I have zipped through and given you a feel for what the sort of open, challenging question in dark matter physics is, I just want to also tell you that there still has been no detection of dark matter. Okay, so we are still awaiting the detection of dark matter. So let me now move on quickly to tell you more about the other dark entity in the universe that, remember, it was not part of the pie diagram. So in terms of the constituents, so black holes do not weigh that much in terms of the overall contribution to the mass of the universe. But as we'll see, they're very consequential in terms of shaping how galaxies form. And this understanding of how important role that black holes play is actually quite recent as well. Black holes were believed to be very marginal. Why? Because, for example, if you take the Milky Way, the black hole at the center of the Milky Way is 4 million times the mass of the sun, 4 million solar masses. The mass of the galaxy itself is 10 to the 12 solar masses. So there's a 6 orders of magnitude difference in mass, right? And yet it turns out that the Milky Way black hole has been instrumental in shaping the star formation history of our galaxy, the assembly history of stars. And as you may have all noticed, there's wonderful work by Andrea Ghez and her collaborators and Reinhard Genzel and his collaborators that was awarded the Physics Nobel Prize for understanding and measuring the mass of the black hole at the center of the Milky Way, and actually showing without a doubt, incontrovertible evidence that it is a black hole. It's not just a cluster of stars. So let me give you a quick outline of where I want to take you with this part of the talk. I want to show you briefly what is the sort of observational evidence for growing black holes. They are called accreting black holes, and the quiescent supermassive black holes. And I want to give you a feel of, just a feel, there's not much time, but I can give you a feel for what kind of modeling work people like me do, and how we use the data, how we use simulations once again. So as you'll see, the theme in both parts of my talk is to give many students a sense of the various approaches to conceptual modeling that you can have, and how numerical simulations, computational work, and observational data are really inseparable ways to build better models to have a deeper understanding. So I'm going to focus, as I mentioned, on the formation of the first black hole seeds, like the very first black holes. So the seed from which the black hole at the center of our Milky Way, for example, assembled. And what's the history? What is the growth history? Much like the growth history of a plant, from the seed that it germinates and the big tree that it becomes, we can track, it turns out, in this cold dark matter framework, because we have this wonderful framework, we can actually track the growth of black holes, and we can sort of play and see, because we do not know how the first black holes formed for sure. We can play with models, we can propagate them forward in time and see if they can be observationally tested with data that we currently have. And what I want to then focus on are, what is fun about model building, which is how do you discriminate between models, right? So if you have two models, how do you discriminate which one is a better description of the universe that we live in? And I'll close with some of the prospects of detecting these early black holes with the James Webb Space Telescope that's going to be launched later this year, and LISA, a mission that is going to be launched by the Europeans, interferometric mission, in another decade or so. So to give you a feel for what I mean by models, like how does the data, how am I using data in these models? So the way the data is used is that we use observational constraints. So we have this framework and a model for how black holes form and how they grow. And as I evolve the model in time, I have to match the observed quantities. So the observed growing black holes, as you all know, are quasars. They are actively growing black holes. And so you have, from observational data, the abundance and the luminosity function of black holes, which are called quasars, in the nearby universe, in the distant universe. So we have this growing inventory of these objects. We now know about hundreds of thousands of these growing black holes. Then we have, so that is resolved black holes. So you can see them optically or in the X-ray, they're growing. then there is a population of black holes that you cannot individually resolve, but you see the collective emission. So obviously the emission from these black holes is not coming from inside the black hole. Obviously, it's, as you all know, matter that goes inside the horizon. There is no information, there's no energy that can come out of the horizon. So what you're really seeing when we say accreting black holes is matter that is flowing in, that is being pulled in by the gravity of the black hole, so a parcel of gas that gets heated to very high temperatures and starts glowing, right? And so that's what we detect. Right? And so the diffuse emission from a population of black holes that you cannot individually resolve is seen as a background. So it's seen as the background haze in X-rays, so cosmic X-ray background. And we know that it's measured. And so any model that I build has to produce a population of black holes that can reproduce this emission. Okay? It's very well measured. Then there are some very interesting correlations between the properties of black holes, supermassive black holes. So basically supermassive is just a code word for anything that's above 1 million times the mass of the sun. And it turns out that most, if not all, galaxies in the universe harbor a central supermassive black hole. And in the nearby universe, most of the black holes are actually dead. They are no longer feeding. They are not quasars. They're just sort of sitting there at the centers. They have ceased activity. But we get something, so we don't get any data from them that has to do with their emission, but we see their gravitational influence. We see that manifested as interesting correlations between the properties of the stellar component, the stars in the inner part of the galaxy that is hosting the black hole at the center. So the mass of the black hole appears to be correlated to the mass of the stars in the inner part of the galaxy. Now that's pretty bizarre, because the black hole, intense as it is, I mentioned to you, is really tiny compared to the mass of a galaxy. So how can it influence stars? So it turns out that black holes actually modulate the formation of stars. And that's what you see as this residual correlation. At least that's what we believe at the moment, right? So, while I was preparing these slides, I was very nostalgically looking back. They were the first attempts to really model populations of black holes in the larger cosmic context, mixing it up with, so you can think of the black hole, so you can think of it as having a parent dark matter halo, a host galaxy, and then you have the black hole sitting in the center. So now, in the universe, you need to integrate the formation and the evolution of all three kind of constituents, because if every galaxy has a black hole in its center, then growing the galaxy and its stars, somehow the black hole has to grow along with it. And the dark matter halo, we know, assembles over time from this standard cold dark matter paradigm that we just saw. So this is some early work that we did, the first set of models. And I just want to show you, especially those of you younger people who are interested in observational work, at that time, this is 1999, redshift 4 was the frontier. It was like, very high redshift. And now you all know that we are finding quasars at 7.5 and so on, when the universe was a small fraction of its current age, right? It's happening all the time. And dark energy had just been suggested, right? So it was really, things have really changed quite a lot. So one of the things that has really changed, which for me has been really, really intriguing, is the discovery of a huge population of objects, high redshift, very distant active black holes seen as quasars. So they are being progressively discovered. And from the luminosities of these quasars, so you can imagine, right, these are distant objects, and you would detect them only if they were incredibly bright. Otherwise, you just wouldn't see them. So you are selecting, you're biased. The biased view that you have is of the beacons, the lighthouses of the universe. Those are the ones that you're finding. But guess what? You're finding a lot of them. It's not just one freaky one. You're finding a population. From their brightnesses, you can infer how big the black hole is, that is, into which this matter is falling in. And when we do that math, we find that the black holes, as you can see on the y-axis here, are 1 billion times to few 10 billion times even the mass of the sun, when the universe, so that's the mass as we detect it as it is right now. So, and that is, assembled to that mass when the universe was a fraction of its current age. So how do you grow from a little seed to billion times the mass of the sun within just a few gigayears? You know, the age of the universe is 13.8 gigayears today, but the redshifts at which, the epochs at which we are seeing these extremely bright quasars is about a fraction of the age of the universe. So that's a huge conundrum. How do you grow the black holes all that fast? That leads me to the key science question, which is the origin. What is the origin? So what are the seed black holes? Let me just get a drink of water. So it turns out that there are a bunch of different ideas. And the traditional idea was that black holes form from the remnants of the first stars that form in the universe. We know that black holes are one consequence of stellar death. So from the first stars that form in the universe, you probably form the first seed black holes. And the reason this was interesting is, remember, the early universe is a less complicated place in the sense it has only hydrogen and helium. It's sort of simple place. So the first stars that form have masses and lifetimes that are short. They're very massive. Lifetimes are short, we believe, and therefore they're quite likely to leave behind black holes. But the black holes that they would leave behind depends on the mass of the star, right? So if the star is 100 times, a few hundred times the mass of the sun, then it would leave behind a black hole that is 10 to 50 times the mass of the sun. If the star was more massive, 1,000 times the mass of the sun, then it could leave you a black hole that is 10 to 100 times the mass of the sun. As you probably guessed from the fact that I'm waving my hands, we actually don't know what the mass of the first star is quite exactly. We know it's probably a few hundred, maybe times the mass of the sun. And as I told you, it is tilted to higher masses than when stars form in the nearby universe. So the remnant black holes are about 10 to 100 solar masses. So that's a pretty wimpy start. If I want to grow it to a billion times the mass of the sun in a very short period in the early universe, this is a pretty sad start to life. It's a very anemic start. So then people started thinking about, could you have other ways to make a more massive seed from the get-go? And the answer is yes. And so I've been working a lot on that, trying to understand these other channels, proposing new models and new channels by which you could form more massive black hole seeds. And this is all in service of trying to explain these rare objects, quasars, that are powered by a billion to few billion times the mass of the sun, black holes at very early times. So one channel that I have worked on, and I think I had assigned as one of the readings, was a Scientific American article in which I provide more details, sketchy details, and the science papers are referenced there if you want to look into it. And that is called direct collapse black holes. And so that's a model that I'll spend a little bit of time on, because that gives you these two contrasting models. First is these light seeds from the first stars, which are strangely referred to by astrophysicists as POP3 stars, and then these direct collapse black holes. So now we have these two models for the starting life of a supermassive black hole. And the question is, can you discriminate? Is there a way to test if nature does operate both these channels, or is there only one channel? So you might ask, why do we need massive black hole seeds? So I just told you the first reason you need them is because you want to explain these quasars. Then in simulations, when people started following and tracking black holes and how they grow, they also found that actually it's very, very hard to make a super duper massive black hole very quickly from a tiny seed. Just doesn't work. Okay, it's very challenging. So this is like a nifty idea that we came up with one of my collaborators, Tal Alexander, where we thought of a way in which your black hole could start life in a very anemic start as a tiny stellar mass black hole, few times the mass of the sun, maybe 10 times, but then it could rove around in a gas-rich nuclear cluster star cluster early on in the universe, these objects form, they're very gas rich, and it could feed, like it could be overfeeding, it could be a glutton, and it could overfeed and grow very rapidly to very high masses. And all we need is for the mass to grow for the seed black hole to be like 10 to the 4, 10 to the 5 solar masses. That's all you need to bump it up to. And then after that, you can very normally grow it by normal feeding without force feeding it to 1 billion times the mass of the sun to explain the observed quasars. So here is the direct collapse seed formation. One reason why I'm particularly interested, I mean, I'm sort of slightly invested in this model, having been one of the early proposers, but the reason this model is interesting is in this model, there is a rationale. Remember that correlations that we saw between the stellar component and the mass of the black hole detected in the nearby universe. For this model of black hole formation, those kind of correlations are predicted by the initial conditions. So they're already built in and baked in. So that's the origin, that's the causation, right? The inference of the causation of that observed correlation comes out of the physics in this model. So which is why I find this model compelling, and it's a good one to compare and contrast with the other model in which we saw seeds form from the first stars, where there is no correlation, no initial correlation between the other stars and the one that dies and leaves a single black hole. So, so this model here, here are some sort of basic ideas. So basically you have gas that settles down in a dark matter halo into a disk because there's angular momentum. That's the preferred configuration. And then there is a global instability in the gas that is induced by bars inside bars. So that these non-axisymmetric disturbances that just cause the gas to really collapse in and fall into the center and condense and form a very massive black hole that is 1,000 to 10,000 times the mass of the sun. So if you want to think about a simple analogy for the physics, it's very much like the kind of instability. You're sitting in a bathtub and you pull the plug out, and remember, you see the vortex, you see the instability that siphons mass in that case, the water in very rapidly. It's a very similar global a disturbance that causes, we believe, that can cause this generation. So one of the interesting things is that while this gas is swirling in and falling, it's going unstable and falling in, you don't want it to fragment and form stars instead. You want it to go right in and make a black hole. That means in order to do that, you for stars to form, to prevent stars from forming, you have to prevent fragmentation and cooling, which means the cooling in the early universe is affected by, there's atomic hydrogen and molecular hydrogen. And molecular hydrogen is a more efficient coolant, and it forms from atomic hydrogen, and you have to actually disrupt the formation of molecular hydrogen. To do that, you need photons of a particular wavelength, okay, that have an energy of between 11 to 13 eV. And those, so you need a source that already produces that. And that source could be the first stars, right? So you could have a nearby location in the universe where you formed the first stars, and the radiation from that in its satellite dark matter halo could catalyze the formation of a direct collapse black hole. So that's the general idea. So now I have shown you how you plant the seed. So I have these two kinds of seeds. Now I'm going to plant them. And then what is the physics prescription for how they grow? So it turns out that, it's very complex physics that controls and regulates the growth of early black holes. So for example, you have an early black hole that is accreting gas and growing, then, as I said, it radiates. So that radiated energy will couple with the gas reservoir out there. And it can either hamper the flow, it can hamper the feeding, or it can amplify the feeding, depending on the conditions. So these have all been investigated in great detail. And so I'm just giving you some of the key nuggets that we currently understand quite well. First, we know that if you start with a larger initial seed mass, and you are sitting in a gas-rich environment, you're going to feed faster, you're going to grow faster. So that already also tells us that having massive initial seeds is going to be helpful because their growth is going to be amplified. And this feedback is the impact of this radiation that is coming out of the growth process. And that, it turns out, it actually limits how fast the black hole can feed gas in. So there, of course, there are two limits. One is the feedback can contain and quench the growth of the black hole. The other thing is you could run out of gas, right? So that's the other limit. If you run out of gas, then, so the gas supply is the ultimate constraint on how fast a black hole can grow. And so, we've done some very nice, simple models. And if any of you is interested, you may want to look at the work by Kwang Ho Park, Massimo Ricordi, and I wrote a couple of papers in 2015 and 2016 that, and one of my former postdocs, Fabio Pacucci. So we have a set of papers where we looked at, what are the growth conditions. So to give you a schematic understanding of what I just showed you, so it turns out that the growth can happen in one of two ways. And they have to do with the gas feeding, the geometry of the gas, and therefore the rate of the feeding and the feedback. And so they largely are these two classes. One of them is this feedback limited model, in which the luminosity that is coming out of the gas that's falling into the black hole is actually directly proportional to the gas feeding rate. Okay, so there's a linear relation between the feeding rate and the luminosity that you see for the quasar. In the other case, in the other extreme of the other limit where we saw, which was gas supply limited, there you notice that the luminosity is now proportional to the logarithm of the mass accretion rate, which means that you could grow the mass much more rapidly than the luminosity would suggest. Right? So you have these two sort of extreme growth modes. So you can see where I'm going with this. Like, I'm building the pieces for a model. So in the model, I've already shown you, you start with two kinds of seeds. Now I'm telling you that the parameter space is growing. There are at least two kinds of growth modes. There's a supply limited growth mode and the feedback limited growth mode. You can now see how I'm going to propagate, right? I'm going to start with a light seed. I'm going to make it get supply limited, feedback limited, propagated. We're going to take a heavy seed, be supply limited, feedback limited, propagated in the future, and see which of these models actually agrees. But there's something very interesting that happens when you have direct collapse black holes and massive initial seeds. So as I mentioned, you have a nearby galaxy where you have the first stars have formed, the radiation is preventing the cooling, you're forming a direct collapse black hole. But it turns out that this halo, this dark matter halo, gravitational potential, in which this direct collapse black hole needs to form, has to be in the vicinity, has to be nearby, which means, and in the early universe, it's a very catastrophic place, things really merge a lot, they collide and merge. Although the dark matter itself is collisionless, the stars in the galaxies will collide and the black holes will collide. So eventually this galaxy that has formed the first stars will collide with the galaxy, with the halo that has formed no stars. So there is no galaxy here, just the black hole. It will merge and it will form a peculiar kind of galaxy in which you have a very massive black hole compared to the mass of the stars. And this, remember, I told you right at the beginning, this is the opposite of what we find in the Milky Way. The mass of the black hole is tiny compared to the mass of the stars. So voila, we have found a place where things are just inverted in the very early universe. So if we are able to detect this peculiar object, it'll have a peculiar spectrum. It's not going to look like the Milky Way. It's not going to look like normal galaxies that have active black holes. The Milky Way, of course, has a dead black hole. But it's not going to look like a galaxy that has a tiny black hole, even though it's an active black hole compared to the mass of the stars. This is going to look like a very different beast. And so we can actually calculate. So this is just to show you what I just mentioned, that you have this peculiar intermediate state. And it turns out we can actually calculate the spectrum, the multi-wavelength wavelength spectrum from an object like that, where you have an accreting black hole, you have a stellar component that is sitting in a dark matter halo, and we can do this computation for the two cases. I can have a black hole that is the direct collapse black hole, which is going to give me this weird object that I'm going to call an obese black hole galaxy. It has an overweight black hole. And so then I can calculate the spectrum, a spectral signature for a galaxy, an early galaxy that has an obese black hole, and one that has a light seed that formed from the population 3 stars, from the first generation of stars. So what's very interesting, so you can do, as I told you, there are these landscape of models. I've already shown you the various parameters, and you just work through the parameter space. And the idea is, can you discriminate? It turns out you can. And the place where you discriminate, where the difference between the two cases shows up dramatically, guess what? Is in the very early universe, of course. That's when the DCBHs form, and is when you will see them in the infrared. So the flux that comes out in the infrared from the two cases is different by orders of magnitude. And guess what? The James Webb Space Telescope is going to have its instruments tuned exactly to the wavelengths, 1 to 30 microns. And that's where the difference shows up. So there we go. So we can play with a whole range of models, and the place where the difference in the models is going to show up, we have narrowed it down. It's going to be in the infrared, and I'll show you in a minute. It will also be from the collisions of black holes later on. So the other there are many other differences that the seeding induced differences in observed properties at late times that we can measure to discriminate seeding that you can come up with. So one of them is the occupation fraction today. I told you the whole game with this modeling is to propagate it forward down to the present day black hole population. So to predict what fraction of current galaxies should all have black holes as a function of mass. So this is, a prediction that shows, so our model predictions are shown in blue and the bottom panels are for the heavy seed, the direct collapse black hole seeds, and the top panels are for the light seeds. And the data are these black dots and the black circles, the black squares. The black circles are relevant because these are data from field galaxies, and the squares are from galaxies in clusters. So remember, that's a special environment, right? There's a lot more dark matter, there's a lot more going on in clusters. So, but that can discriminate, but the key discriminant is going to be the JWST observation. So if you have a population 3 black hole sitting in an early galaxy, then JWST will not detect that kind of galaxy at redshift 9. So if JWST finds a galaxy with the spectrum like we are predicting, it will detect it because it has that spectral shape. That's by definition how we'll find the objects. Then it has to have been a direct collapse black hole. And it would be an obese black hole galaxy because those are the only detectable ones. You don't see the other ones. So if you find anything, if you find a quasar-like object at a redshift 9 or beyond, it has to have come from a very massive seed. So the other clear-cut, so that's one clear-cut way to discriminate between seeding models, right? And I already told you there are these many different accretion physics, like broadly speaking, I reduced them to 2 to simplify. So, there's differences in accretion as well, the accretion physics and how the black hole grows. So it turns out that you need with another discriminant, which is finally, remember, galaxies grow because of collisions. When galaxies collide, if they both contain black holes, they will collide, they will produce gravitational waves. Now we've detected gravitational waves from stellar mass black holes. We are now talking about supermassive black holes. Those should be detectable with the LISA mission, European mission, that is going to fly up. It's an interferometer in space that's going to fly in the 2030s. And these are the event rate predictions. So all you need to notice is that the purplish blue colors are heavy seeds, and the orangish red ones are the event rates predicted for the light seeds. So if you have light seeds, they are more abundant. And remember, I told you these direct collapse black holes are more rare. So that's why you see many more events. You will see many more black hole collisions, supermassive black hole collisions. And that number will tell you, give you an insight on whether you have, depending on the number that you detect, you can say something about seeding. So these are the two sort of key things. But you might ask, this is great, but there have to be uncertainties, right? Things can't be that clear cut. You're absolutely right. And this is where there's lots of new work to be done. And this is a lot of work. I mean, I should mention here, give a shout out in particular to Jane. Jane has been looking at many of these questions, many related questions, and there's a lot to do. So let me first show you, as I conclude, what are the sort of big uncertainties? You know, uncertainties are really where the exciting discoveries remain to be made, right? Because we don't understand it right now. So the uncertainties in LISA events, right, is that we don't actually know the details of the dynamics of supermassive black hole binary mergers. When these two black holes merge, they have merged after two galaxies have merged. It's a very messy place. And not only will we see gravitational waves from these objects, but en route, we are likely to see a lot more electromagnetic signatures, because there's gas. It's going to get heated, it's going to glow, and we should be able to see both precursors and postcursors observationally. Theoretically, this is a place where there are many open questions. I mean, how important is the gas? How much gas do we have? What role does it play? What's the angular momentum of the gas? Is there friction from the gas? How does that work? How quickly do the two black holes merge, etc.? They're all open questions. We have some idea, but there are many interesting open questions. Then, as I mentioned, what are the drivers of black hole growth, right? I've kind of alluded to the fact that you obviously have accretion of gas, but you also have crashing into each other collisions. And the question is something like the Milky Way black hole that we see today, what fraction of its mass assembled from collisions versus accretion of gas? So that's an open question. We have some ideas, again, we have some ideas about how the most massive guys assemble, for example, but there's a lot of work to be done there too. And then, of course, the seeding physics, right? There are many more interesting open questions. You know, are there even more channels to form black hole seeds? What is the efficiency? How efficiently do direct collapse black holes form? What is the initial mass function of seeds? What is the distribution of masses of initial seeds? And what happens? So this is an angle that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is, you know, black hole formation doesn't stop in the universe. Black holes will keep forming. And the question is, how do you incorporate that into the modeling, right? And so the most new exciting work that we have that I want to finish with is that you might ask, do we know all the black holes? Have we figured out how many black holes there really are? Guess what? We haven't. And it turns out that if you look at simulations of galaxy formation with all the black hole collisions and everything put into them as ingredients, you find that not all black holes end up in the centers of galaxies. There's a huge population of lost wandering black holes that as a result of merging activity that are littered around. So here are some top-down views of galaxies that form in a very high-resolution simulation called the Romulus suite. And what you see here with little vector directions and little dots are the wandering black hole population. So there's a central guy, supermassive guy, and there are other supermassives and other massive black holes that are floating around. So these are three different examples. It varies from galaxy to galaxy. Why? Because each galaxy has a very peculiar trajectory. It's like us, it's like every human being has a very different life story, right? So I think what is most exciting to me right now, and I see this as a very exciting growth area, is really doing a full census. Where are all the black holes? What sizes are they? Where are they? And how do we find them? So I want to close with the fact that this wandering population of black holes sadly may end up wandering in places where there isn't much gas, so you may not see them. but you're likely to detect them using tidal disruption events. So this is the kind of work that Jane and her collaborators have been working on for a very long time. And, observationally, those events are picking up. And I think theoretically, they remain very, very exciting. So I will just stop there and take questions. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Natarajan. This is a truly exciting lecture. So in the following, we will proceed with the Q&A session. So first, we will invite the panel members to ask questions and have some discussions, and then we will address the questions from the general audience. So while the panel members are discussing, anyone of the general audience can start typing your questions into the chat room, and we will select questions from there. Okay, so now let's start with the panel.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for a really exciting and stimulating talk. For the second part, could the seeding of the first black holes be done by dark matter? Could even be the first stars be dominantly dark matter stars? And thereby they can get very massive?
Right. That's a great question. So one of the intriguing things, right, I mentioned that the equation of state of dark matter, cold dark matter, is pressure equals 0. So it doesn't compress very well. So sadly, you can't condense dark matter as efficiently as you can condense ordinary matter. So we believe that even though you might form a peculiar class of stars early on in the universe, which may have a little bit of dark matter, if you actually compare the density of dark matter in the regions where you think the first stars would assemble, the density of baryons is almost 6-fold higher than that of dark matter. So dark matter, the nature of dark matter that we so far seem to have inferred is just too diffuse to do that. But the inverse question, Ming Chung, has been asked, and it's an active area of research, which is, can dark matter be made of little black holes, right? So that the inverse of your question is something also that people have asked, and that is being investigated. And at the moment, it's a nice theoretical argument. At the moment, there is really no observational evidence that supports. So and the people try to make to compose all dark matter with 30 solar mass black holes. So that was the kind of, because there's a window between about 10 to 100 solar masses of black holes where there are very few constraints. I mean, increasingly we are going to have, LIGO constraints, but before that, it looks like LIGO is actually finding some very massive unexpected black holes, but there was like a window up to maybe even 100, 300 solar masses. There was like a window where we didn't have any constraints. So you can do what you want, right? You can, for a theorist, an open window is an open door to play.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. That was a great question. Jane, I think Jeremy has his hand up.
Okay, thank you, Professor Natarajan. Thank you for motivating our students into very different and exciting fields. I want to go back to the issue of dark matter.
Yeah.
To open up the discussion even more, I want to get your thoughts about the possibility of wave-like or fuzzy dark matter being the right answer, since it does avoid some of the difficult problems in WIMPs, cold dark matter.
Yeah. So that's also a fantastic question. And you're all asking me questions that are really like at the cutting edge, right? We are all writing, refereeing papers about this stuff right now. So the, fuzzy dark matter was proposed as an alternative that could explain the kind of early problems in cold dark matter that I suggested, right? The shape of the density profile, because fuzzy dark matter, because of the quantum nature of the inner part of it, it basically behaves like a Bose-Einstein condensate. It has a sort of a turnover, sort of softening core. It has a core, a finite core. It's not a power law. So that was the motivation for looking at those kinds of models. As I told you, for that problem, we have other resolutions that have worked out. And the final conundrum that I showed you, this new gap that we found, it actually goes in the opposite direction. So fuzzy dark matter will not help you resolve the discrepancy that we find in the galaxy-galaxy strong lensing cross-section. I showed you the order of magnitude discrepancy. In the efficiency of lensing by small-scale clumps, it actually goes in the wrong direction. So that doesn't resolve that problem. But still, fuzzy dark matter is something people are really trying to understand. And I am supportive of this partly because you might have all realized, right? I mean, other than Occam's razor, there is no other reason to believe that we have only one kind of dark matter. I mean, we are finding real trouble finding even one kind, right? But it's quite possible that there are multiple kinds of dark matter that operate on different scales and so on and so forth. Therefore, understanding, these alternative models is very important. So, I mean, I find fuzzy dark matter quite cool and quite exciting because, what they do is they patch it on. So they need it, as I said, to just resolve the inner parts of galaxies, the issue on the inner part of the density profile. And so they patch it on to the rest of the normal density profile. So, it has a skirt that is the normal density profile that you get from simulations. And then you have an inner region that is sort of fuzzy.
In the spirit of us not understanding everything about everything, my group is working on fuzzy dark matter, and we're writing a paper right now that shows that the small scale problem is actually consistent with what we observe.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, not the galaxy-galaxy strong lensing problem.
I'm talking about the galaxy-galaxy strong lensing problem.
Oh, really? Okay, you can actually resolve it with fuzzy dark matter?
Yes.
Oh, I'd be very curious to see that. Yes, please do send me the preprint. That's really exciting.
Okay.
Yeah, because our initial sort of investigation from just using scaling relations, it didn't seem to go in the right direction. Okay. So, yeah, great. Thank you. Yeah.
Any more questions from the panel?
Yeah, may I ask a follow-up question on that? For the galaxy-galaxy strong lensing probability,
yeah.
Do we really trust the simulation so well? Because I understand that there'll be a lot of baryon physics and probably a lot of the black hole seeding, accretion, and so on. Those are not in the simulation now. Yeah. Whereas in the cluster center, I suppose those are very important. Can you comment a little bit on that?
Yeah, great. No, that's a great question. So in the galaxy-galaxy strong lensing cross-section, so when we try to explain the observed small-scale lensing events, so what we are really sensitive to is mass within apertures for lensing. So it's a mass enclosed within apertures. And so the kind of apertures we are talking about are range in sort of a physical scale of 5 to 10 kiloparsecs. So that is a region within which mass enclosed that is well outside the optical radius of galaxies. So, we believe, therefore, that, whatever mess is happening in the center, that, it's really not going to be the principal limitation. However, you're absolutely right that we know that simulations have some systematics. So for example, at the moment, and I think I'm going to go out on a limb and say this, there isn't a single simulation of a galaxy cluster that can explain all the properties, observed properties of cluster galaxies, the baryon fraction of cluster galaxies, the stellar masses of cluster galaxies, the baryon fraction of the overall cluster, the temperature simultaneously. The point is you have to simultaneously match everything. So there are simulations that match the X-ray properties and therefore, properties of the overall baryon fraction well, but not that of the galaxies. And the luminosity function and the radial distribution of cluster galaxies. So there isn't a single simulation that does that. And we are absolutely sure that obviously that is where the mismatch is coming from, because simulations are not able to match that. So, there have been recent works, there have been people claimed, after our paper came out, which was fantastic to see a lot of groups very excited about it. And they're like, hey, my simulation can match one. And we're like, okay, but can you match everything? You have to match everything that's observed and explain this. Because, you can always tweak an element, as you said, something in the feedback, something in the efficiency of star formation. You can alter the stellar mass a little bit, change the mass enclosed within that radius somehow. But the point is, you have to simultaneously explain the visible observed properties of cluster galaxies. And there isn't a single simulation yet that does that.
Thank you again.
Thank you. I think Jeremy has a follow-up question. I'm curious.
Oh, okay. I want to turn to black holes now.
Sure, please.
So this issue of finding very massive black holes in the early universe, how does that connect with our understanding of the relationship between black hole and galaxy masses in the local universe? Why is there this coevolution when there was no coevolution in the early universe?
Right. I mean, we believe that, that there was likely no coevolution in the initial conditions for a light seed channel. For the direct collapse black hole channel, there is, because the properties of the halo in which the formation of the direct collapse is facilitated is already one in which we can see that there's a scaling that starts out. So first, it turns out that, this thing that I alluded to with the feedback, the radiative feedback and the energy input from the accreting black hole into the surrounding gas as a function of scale, it happens on a function of many scales. We believe that that feedback process over time will cause coevolution and can imprint this correlation. But there's also another very mundane, banal way in which you can get a correlation. And that's from the central limit theorem. If you keep colliding halos, you will eventually get a correlation. And in cold dark matter, it is all driven by hierarchical assembly of dark matter halos, and therefore the collision of galaxies and the collision of black holes. You find that over time, with the central limit theorem, you can also get a correlation. I think the other thing is that the black hole, there are many observers who will tell you that they believe only 2 local black hole masses. The Milky Way, well, 3 now, I guess M87 after the Event Horizon Telescope estimate. So M87, Milky Way, and NGC 4258, the maser. So those are the only 3 ones people, and they'll say, well, 3 are not going to make a correlation, and that there could be a lot of scatter. And yes, we don't quite understand that. And I think you hit the nail on the problem. That people like me are really interested in whether this correlation that we see is actually causation. I mean, is there actually physical causation because of this DCBH or something else? Or is it just the central limit theorem that is in operation? It's just a statistical, accumulation over time. Because we are seeing this correlate. What would be great is if we could measure this correlation between the properties of the mass of the black hole and the mass of the stellar component or the luminosity or whatever at some other redshift. We don't have that measurement yet. It's challenging, but I think that's coming. That's coming. So if we have, if we can peg, if there is the relationship and it evolves, the slope and the amplitude, etc., evolve, say at redshift 1, redshift 2, then we have something for the models to explore.
Okay. So my response is that if you appeal to the central limit theorem, then we have to be living in a very special time, epoch in history, right?
No, we just live at a time where a lot of mergers have happened. It's not all that special. It's just that, that the mergers that we are living at a time, most of the mergers happen in the early universe. So the merger rate is much higher in the early universe. So it just tells you that we are living at a time when the majority of mergers have occurred in the past.
Right, that's what I mean by rather.
Yeah.
The second thing is that we have actually measured a mass of a black hole at Z of about 0.3 using gravitational lensing.
That's right.
So that's something my graduate
Yeah,
students.
that's one. Yeah, there is one. I was going to say, and there are, a couple of cases as well of, I would say, above average believability of black hole measurements from multiple techniques, from reverberation mapping and masers and so on. So there are a few cases, but we don't have enough to look to see if you have a correlation.
Yeah.
Not yet.
No, that's
Yeah.
That's just another application of gravitational lensing.
Lensing. Oh yeah. Oh no, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a question. So a lot of the studies that we have on this black hole galaxy coevolution are these days motivated by these high redshift quasars, very luminous quasars that we observe, which is very exciting. But we also know, like, for example, most of the galaxies we see nowadays, like our Milky Way, is not one of those very massive luminous galaxies.
Yeah.
It's probably like a dwarf or intermediate mass black hole at that time, like a redshift 6 or 7. So is it possible like these two different types of galaxies can, the black holes in them can be seeded from different models? Like, is there that they're trying to use one model or have a complete?
No. Yeah. So I think that's a great question. And it is something I should have clarified, Jane. And that is that we believe that the population 3 seeding is inevitable. And it occurs in the universe no matter what, because the first stars have to form. I mean, we are here, the stars we see are there. So the first stars have to form. They have to leave remnants. The only question is the masses of the stars themselves, and therefore the uncertainty in the masses of the remnants. The DCBH channel is really, it's a rare occurrence because it requires a lot of conditions, as I alluded to. There are many restrictions, right, on the sites. So it turns out that there are sites in the universe, at least in the simulated universe, that satisfy those criteria, and they are rare. And we want them to be rare because they explain only the most massive end of the black hole mass function or the brightest end of the quasar luminosity function, which is what we see. So what we really see in the very early universe is what we have access to is preferentially the brightest quasars. So, I had one more slide that I just want to show now that you have asked this question. I'm very tempted. I was, trying to keep to the time. I didn't want to, go on any longer than I did. But I just wanted to show this because, many of you've all asked such fantastic questions that this is some new work that I do want to advertise, which is going to be submitted very soon next week. And that is a new idea that, after sitting and working on these models with all these uncertainties, right, it's been kind of frustrating, exciting, and yet frustrating. What's the next step? So the next step is, of course, machine learning when we have a lot of data. And the way we are going to do this, we've created a new research platform working with Google X. I've collaborated with people from there. It's called QuasarNet. And what we are doing is we are co-locating observational data and simulations. What we are going to do is we have a database of all quasars. So this pilot project is just redshift 3 and above quasars. And what we are going to do, and we have simulation slices. And I think it gets back to Jeremy's question and earlier question. So I think the fundamental thing in the universe is not just the black hole, is not just the galaxy halo connection, but the black hole galaxy parent halo connection. And so we need to connect all those 3 elements because we live in a cold dark matter driven universe. So we need to integrate those elements into the model in a much sharper way than we've done before. So what this allows us to do, so here we have slices from a simulation. In this particular case, it's only a dark matter only simulation. But as you know, these simulation volumes are never large enough to mimic the Sloan Digital Sky Survey volume, where if I find a redshift 3 quasar, I can't associate it with the location in my simulation because my simulation box is too small. But machine learning will allow me to make a mock box of the right size for every survey and then allow me to do these association studies. And just the kinds of questions all of you have been asking me, right? So I can then pick and I can say, okay, the most massive dark matter halo hosts the most massive galaxy, hosts the most massive black hole, or not. I can say, well, maybe it's not a direct correlation. Maybe I start with an anti-correlation, or I start with a weak correlation, and then I can evolve it. So anyway, watch out for this paper. We'll put it on the archive in the next week or so. But I just couldn't resist sharing this, because all of your questions are kind of going in, okay, what is the utility of, how are we going to probe further these correlations?
Thank you. That's very interesting. Look forward to reading that. So I think because of the time constraint, let's perhaps better move to address the questions from the audience. So Hugo, would you like to elaborate a question?
Yes, thank you very much for the lecture. It was very interesting. So I would like to come back on the first part of your.
Oh, by the way, Hugo,
talk.
I read one of your papers recently. It was fab. Yeah, so congrats for
Thank you very much. Yeah, so I want to come back on the first part of your talk, where you say that you have this discrepancy between the simulations and observations. And so you mentioned that we have this cusp-core problem, which you can explain with feedback, or you can also explain with alternative theory of dark matter, like self-interacting dark matter. And yeah, for instance. And so you said that to explain this overabundance of substructures in the halos, you may need an alternative theory of dark matter. And do you have any suggestions? Are there people who have suggested alternative theories that can actually reproduce this data?
Well, okay, so
question.
that's a great question. When we wrote the paper, we held off writing the paper thinking, we wanted to propose a solution. And then in the end, we decided that, we're just going to leave it for everyone to explore. So the one solution that I have studied a little bit, I haven't written up the paper yet, and that is, in interacting dark matter, you can have core collapse. And if you are able to effect core collapse with a self-interacting dark matter halo, then the inner regions become very high density. So you don't, this is en route to the collapse. You haven't collapsed and you don't become a black hole, but just before that. So you have the process of sort of core collapse. And at that time, you have enough mass, enough enhanced density in the center to actually account for that mass distribution and the concentration that we need. But whether that means that we're not making any tall claims about having making a case for a new kind of dark matter. I mean, it's worth playing with, but I think the more likely solution is really going to come from the simulations that we are missing. We know, for example, and this, right, that dynamical friction is very poorly modeled in simulations at the moment, and so that needs to be improved for sure. That's we know that that's one place, and then we also know there are some numerical artifacts. There are things that happen. You have artificial stripping, overstripping, over-efficient tidal stripping. So we know both dynamical friction and tidal stripping are not modeled well at the moment.
Because there are some simulations which use alternative theory. For instance, Andrew Ponce, and he has these simulations with self-interacting dark matter. Do you know if they have those structures?
No, they don't have. So the models that have built so far, there are only analytic models in which we can proceed to core collapse. Getting that to happen in a simulation is quite hard, and I don't know. So the person, if you're curious to read, I think the person who's written a little bit about core collapse, not in this context, but for other reasons, is Manoj Kaplinghart and his group at UC Irvine. They have, I think they have 2 papers. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting.
Okay, due to the time constraint, let's have a last question from Leo Feng.
Jane, I'm happy to stay on. I don't mind if people want to ask questions. Unless you guys are getting late, I'm having fun. So I'm happy to stay on. Yeah.
Good to know. I probably have more questions to ask, but I think the event has to end in a few minutes officially.
Okay.
So Leo, would you like to read your questions?
Okay, sure. So first, thank you, Professor Natarajan, for the very inspiring talk.
Thank you.
So I realized that in the very first part of your talk, you talked about the CDM scenarios. But
Yeah.
it seems like collisionless CDM, the gas will self-collapse and organize into a core and halo. So which can be considered as two phases of the self-gravitating gas. So, but in CDM, we do not introduce any extra interactions. So we will expect the gravity, which is monotonic, will only organize the density profile of a dark matter halo into
an
one,
NFW form. Yeah.
into one single power law form. So the
Yeah.
problem is why the NFW form will naturally forms in the simulation.
Right.
Because in
No,
NFW, we have a core and a halo.
Right. So I think that's a deep question. People have looked at it. People have looked at the statistics, you know, treating this cold dark matter system, aggregate of particles, as a statistical ensemble, and try to see if there's anything about phase-space equilibrium that actually drives you to a power law, right? So there have been some investigations. So I think Henriksen et al. Is an old paper where they looked at trying to come up with a statistical distribution as explanation, a statistical mechanical description. But, you know, I think it's not completely done. So that's another very interesting direction to pursue, to try and understand, you know, the deeper reason. Is there something much more fundamental about, you know, the combination of the nature of gravity and collisionless equation of state that kind of drives you in phase space to something that is a pure, yeah, I mean, you know, when you look at the distribution functions and you look at simulations and you analyze them, you know, you find f of e, the distribution functions, to be exponential, like to a very good degree. And so there's something about the collective behavior of dark matter particles that kind of drives them there. So maybe there's some kind of attractor solution. I think those have been proposed. So that's a great, yeah, that's a great question and comment. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Actually, I think last year there is a paper that's derived why there is a correlation between the core and the halo for the scenario of bosonic dark matter and fermionic dark matter. And for these two scenarios, they have a slightly different prediction between the scaling relation. So they claim that in that way, we can distinguish between dark matter, whether it's more like a boson or fermion, like surround neutrino or something else.
Right.
So yes, but I wonder why in CDM, which is the most simplest case, this scaling relation still exists.
Right.
And it seems that this scaling relation ruins our previous intuition, that's to use the scaling relation to distinguish the bosonic nature or the fermionic nature.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Due to the time constraint, it has been a pleasure, a great pleasure, but we have to end the event now. So on behalf of the Faculty of Science, I would like to thank Professor Natarajan for giving us this very enlightening lecture. And I would also like to thank all the panel members, the organization team, and all the audience who has participated today. Thank you all very much, and I hope you have a great day.